So I was just thinking about how podcasting really changed my ability to level up. There were so many things that I was thinking about in my practice that would come up with clients, and or just how I was running the practice. And the podcast really allowed me to explore this on just like a much deeper level. And so one thing I did is I put together this podcast, but then also took some time to think about that process of starting a podcast. And I've put a ton over at podcastlaunchschool.com as a way to just help therapists that want to start a podcast. We have a bunch of services over there if you're looking to go full tilt. But honestly, just starting a podcast, learning about it, we have tons over at podcastlaunchschool.com, and we'd love for you to check it out. This is the Practice of the Practice podcast with Joe Sanok, session number 1403. I'm Joe Sanok, your host, and welcome to the Practice of the Practice podcast, where we help you build a thriving private practice you absolutely love. We want both sides of it. We want you to know the marketing, know the systems, know all those things it takes to run a practice, but we also want you to love it. We want you to be creative, become a better human, to feel more fulfilled, to have more happiness, but also to recognize all those emotions that come up in running a business, but also outside of just your business, make your life and your community's life better. So we are so excited to have our guest today. We have David Epstein with me, who is the author of the #1 New York Times bestseller, Range, and the New York Times bestseller, The Sports Gene. He has a master's degree in both environmental science and journalism, and has worked as a senior writer for Sports Illustrated and an investigative reporter with ProPublica. And his brand new book, Inside the Box: How Constraints Make Us Better, just came out, and he lives in Washington, D.C. David, welcome to the Practice of Practice podcast.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I am so excited to have you here. You know, when we do our conversation before we get started, I always love when it's like time out, save it for the show, like we're off and running, and that just happened. So can't wait to talk about constraints today. Let's start with, you had said before we started rolling that you needed to learn constraints, and that was part of why you wanted to do the research for this book. Where were you at in your life? What was going on where you said, you know, I should write a book about constraints so I can learn some things from my own life?
Yeah, hefty dose of me search in this book for sure. And it was sort of twofold, my professional and personal. Professionally, with my first two books, I didn't do a good job of really defining the box at the beginning of the project. And so I actually ended up writing 150% the length that I was allotted, and then having to cut back to get a book. So I mean, I took a trip to Arctic Sweden in my first book that then didn't fit the book. And if I had done more planning ahead of time, I would have realized that. And after Range, I became a parent and said, I can't be writing a book and a half to get a book anymore. I need to be more efficient with my time. And so this time around, really based on a suggestion from one of the people I was interviewing about constraints, I made on one page and one page only an outline of, actually, I have it right behind me. Hold on.
Oh, we got to see it.
For people who would see this, but I forced myself to make a outline, a structural architecture of the book. You can see I wrote as small as possible to defeat my
you gave yourself one page, but it's like when a teacher in college gives you one like 3x5 card, and it's like 0.4.
You squeeze it in.
Yeah.
You squeeze it in. But this is the condensation of 100,000 word note sheet basically that I had into one page. So even with small writing, it still forced me to ruthlessly prioritize what topics I wanted in the book, and to find a way to structure them sensibly. And if it's not on that page, it's not in the book. And that made me so much more efficient in the writing. So the book's 20% shorter than my previous two. It's tighter, more coherent. And I turned it in early, which I didn't even know was a thing with books. So it really made a huge difference for me. And along with that, I was looking in my personal life where I was letting up work kind of. With my previous two books also, I had sort of said, well, letting it swallow my whole life is my competitive advantage, And I don't think that was good for my well-being. It certainly wasn't what I wanted to do once I became a dad. And so I wanted to put boundaries around my own work and workday. So, for example, I borrowed, in the book, I profile a woman named Isabel Allende, one of the greatest living writers. And one of the things she does is she lights a candle to start her workday and blows it out to finish it and closes the door. And like, I'm done thinking about that for the day. Because you actually do need that recovery. I think I was wrong to think that you can just focus endlessly. I mean, I know I was wrong now because of the research that I did for this book. But so I borrowed that with electric candles, not with flames in my office, and just started, arranging my life in a way that where I kind of scheduled things that were important to me personally the way I do with work things, because they are as important and often more important, but yet I wouldn't carve out specific time and focus for those things. So I'm a lot more intentional about structuring my focus now.
Now, when you were writing, did you just give yourself a certain period of time per day or per week, or was it only on a certain day you were writing? Like how did you actually structure out when you were going to put in that time?
Yeah, so my book projects tend to be about 2 years. I mean, I get interested in the topics before I realize I'm writing a book, so it's hard to say exactly when it starts. But in terms of the formal start, it's a 2-year process for me. And in the first 2 books, I'd say for the first about 6 months, I don't write at all. I'm just interviewing and reading papers and kind of making a map of the landscape of ideas. This time, I didn't start writing for a year. And as I wanted to do this more planning, and when I did that 1-page outline, then when I moved into execution of writing, it was way faster than I've ever done in the past. And once I moved into that phase of writing, so it was doing this kind of constraint exercise of the 1-page architecture. It certainly slowed down the time it took me to get started on the writing. But then once I moved into writing, it was so much faster. And then it would be, normal work day. I mean, I would drop my son off at school or when it started at daycare. And when he came through the door at the end of the day, that was the end of my work day for that day. So I would shut down. So it was not the way that it used to be where I would go back to it in the wee hours, basically. So I had a more contained work day. And again, I was sitting on the book for a few weeks because I was done. I didn't even know what to do. And so it actually ended up making me more efficient, and the ability to, one of my friends who writes about human performance talks about identity being a house, and you don't want to spend all your time in one room. And I think the ability to move from that writer room to something else actually really made me feel refreshed. And even though I wasn't spending as many hours doing my work, I was so much more efficient when I actually sat down to do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that, as I was writing Thursday as the new Friday, I decided to only give myself Thursdays to write. And it was interesting because, when you you have, a timeline that the publisher, is expecting that manuscript. And I had my word count, and every, week I'd do subtract, and I wanted to be about 20% above to allow for editing. But it really helped because I would write, and then at the end of each session, I would go to my whiteboard and take everything off of my Trello, my notes, and just sketch out the next chapter, so that I was starting kind of marinating in that. And it would be interesting how, I remember specifically the curiosity chapter, and I was just had this all up on the board, and I would walk past it as I'm going to my bedroom, and it was on a Tuesday or something. I was like, wait, curiosity killed the cat. Where'd that come from? I would just put that on the whiteboard. And then it would be these questions would come up in my subconscious. And then when it was time to write on Thursday, it was I was just off and running. And it really just helped me, again, to have that constraint to say, Thursday you write, you got to be as prepared as possible. So it's I had my green smoothie, I had my coffee, I was had everything all set up and ready to go, because I knew I needed to get X number of words written that day, or at least a major first draft that was pretty good for that chapter.
Yeah, I think that, it's interesting that anyone who's kind of spent time studying great writers they're all have some kind of rituals and practices that are really important, because they have to, typically don't have a boss in a traditional sense, and so have to structure their own time, and that becomes really important, as is that kind of toggling that you were talking about between different modes. So, for example, in Inside the Box, I write a little bit about Maya Angelou, where she would go and rent hotel rooms to do her writing, and she wanted to focus so much that she would have the hotel staff take the paintings off the wall in the room, so there was nothing else for her to focus on. And yet, she would also do things like bring crossword puzzles because she knew she needed to toggle between what she called her big mind, where she was doing her focused writing, and her little mind, where she was doing something that was just easier and kind of incubating. And I don't think it's not an accident that people often have good ideas in the shower while they're on a run, where I think it activates what neuroscientists call the default mode network, where you're less goal directed and you start making connections. And so I think some of what you're talking about is like you had this time carved out for the task oriented writing, but then it also allowed this time for the incubation. And I think structuring your work in a way where you're toggling between those modes is really important.
Yeah. Well, so take us into some of the ideas you cover in the book around constraints. Like, let's start with, what did you learn that surprised you?
I mean, I'd say one of the first big surprises, there were a few surprises. Some had to do with attention and focus, but the first thing was probably that too much freedom makes people really uncreative. So, and I was not alone in thinking that. There was actually, in the introduction, I cite this international survey that was recently done by psychologists about creativity myths. So these are things that we know from research that are not true. And the most popular one was that people are most creative when they're most free. And once I got into this research, you actually find that that's not the case at all, because our brains, as the cognitive scientist Daniel Willingham says, you may think your brain's made for thinking, but it's actually made for preventing you from having to think whenever possible, because thinking is energetically costly. And so you'll do the convenient thing or the path of least resistance when you can. And so to be creative, you actually need the convenient path blocked. So as one psychologist called this, the green eggs and ham effect, where Dr. Seuss famously wrote Green Eggs and Ham on a bet that he couldn't write a book using only 50 words. And it forced him to experiment with rhythm because he couldn't be expansive with his vocabulary. And so actually the quickest way to make people more creative is whatever the status quo way they do something is, or the convenient solution, is say, that is blocked. And instantly they start becoming more creative. So that was a bit of a surprise to me.
Like just this week, that reminds me, at improv practice, Nicole, our teacher, we just had a big show this past weekend at the Traverse City Comedy Fest. And, we were debriefing that, but then it was like, we're going to do some more reps with we do long form. So it's like 15-minute kind of set. And she said, we're in this space that has a stage and has probably 3 little wings of like chairs that go up probably 10 or so. So it's like a full stage area. And she said, I want you to use this entire space. Like she said, you can use the chairs, the bathroom, the entire space however you want. And the very first scene, these guys, Chad and Pete, the prompt was marzipan. And he's like, I have a whole basket of marzipan. And then he's like, how much marzipan do you have? And then Pete like opened a pretend window and said, the man has marzipan. And then like I ran to like the back of the whole like complex and yelled like, what kind of marzipan? So it like changed everything, where the entire space, the height, the length became our palette. Whereas usually we're just on the stage. And then the round 2, she did this other thing where she said, I want the first scene, whatever you do noise-wise, the next scene just needs to think about sound differently. And so and that's all she gave us. And so it's like we looked at pacing, we looked at speed, we looked at volume, we looked at where we were at. And it's exactly what you're talking about, where those constraints of saying, okay, we need you to move your body more, you need to use different sound, unlocked scenes that we never would have done if we had just been talking heads on the stage.
Yeah, I mean, that's a classic where you have to use sound differently, or you have to use the stage in a different way. What psychologists would call a preclude constraint, psychologists who study creativity, where it's like it's blocking you from doing the usual thing and instantly launches you into this productive exploration. And some of what you're saying also, I think specificity is really important, right? It's its own kind of constraint, where I write in the book about this researcher named Keith Sawyer, who's kind of an eminent researcher of creativity, and he actually talks about improv, and he'll say things like, in improv, you don't want to just say, like, specificity is hugely important because it gives your partner a box to work inside of. So you don't just want to say, look, it's a gun. You want to say, look, it's an X-3000 destroyer ray gun or something. And it gives the person something concrete to start working off of. So sort of the more concrete you can be, the more you would think that limits the options of your partner, but it actually gives them something to grab onto and work with. So that was
Yeah.
some of what he wrote about.
Now, when you think about how you're seeing people apply these constraints, what are some examples? I'm sure you cover lots of case examples in the book. What are some that stood out to you as to how people are using constraints to change the way they approach their work or how they approach projects they're working on?
Yeah, a lot of different categories, but I think one thing that I saw across domains that often was helpful for people was making all of their current commitments visible and then taking something away. So this was often individuals, but also with teams often where even like one project that's in process per post-it note and you put them on a wall. And typically when people do this, they realize that if a team does this, they typically realize there's more in process than anybody realized, and more than they can possibly get done, and that a lot of medium priorities are competing with larger priorities. And so I think a useful thing is to do that, make all your current commitments visible, and then do basically a subtraction audit where you say, if I had to take something away in the next 90 days, what would it be? Because humans have what appears to be a hardwired bias to add, to solve problems always by adding, and to overlook solutions that involve taking things away. It's called subtractive neglect bias. And there's some fun studies with this, where one by this researcher at Virginia named Leidy Klotz, where, for example, I just think this one's funny, where he had a Lego structure and the participants were asked to bolster it so they would balance a masonry brick over the head of a Star Wars stormtrooper figure. And people could add as many Lego pieces as they wanted, but they had to pay for every piece that they added. And yet most people still added multiple pieces and paid, when taking just this one Lego piece away would have instantly solved the problem. And it's extremely obvious once you show people, but we're wired to overlook solutions that involve subtraction. So I think doing regular subtraction audits where you list all the things that are in process and say, look, something has to go. And maybe that thing just moves into a holding pattern where there's this one constraint that some teams found useful that I wrote about. It's called stop starting and start finishing. Where you say, okay, you just can't bring something new into the funnel of active projects until something else moves out the bottom of the funnel. And it tends to reduce multitasking and lead people to actually get more done. So they may feel that this is dangerous because you're not toggling between all these many things in process, but it's actually usually both causes people's stress to go down some because they're not juggling as many projects, and then they actually start finishing things more rapidly. So it may feel precarious at first, but the evidence shows that people actually start getting a lot more done.
Something I hear over and over from practice owners in the Practice Academy is the one class I never was taught in grad school was how to run my business. And honestly, I felt that same thing. It's not a personal failing, but it's a gap in how we train clinicians. You build something that's real, your private practice, and nobody handed you a playbook for intake, billing, team management, or what it actually takes to scale past a handful of clinicians. That's what Valent is built for. Valent is the EHR designed exclusively for behavioral health group practices. With 2 decades of experience, 13 million clients engaging in their EMR, and 28,000 providers using their platform, Valent offers the tools that close the gap in your documentation, billing, and operations. Also, they include AI that handles the admin work so that your team will stay focused on your clients. Valent created a free interactive resource specifically for group practice owners like you. It's called Breaking Through the Growth Ceiling. It's called Breaking Through the Growth Ceiling. In literally 5 minutes, it pinpoints your biggest bottleneck right now with a 90-day playbook to fix it. It is awesome. So if you want to break through the ceiling of growth that you feel like you just haven't been able to break through, grab that for free over at valent.io/Joe. That's valent.io/Joe. Valent is spelled VALANT.io/Joe. Yeah, I think, being someone who tends to be pretty creative, I think you're naming something that my team says to me, like, all right, Joe, let's put that in the holding tank. And I like that idea of having a mantra like stop starting, start finishing, for the whole team to just say, like, yeah, let's focus in on those KPIs that matter the most, not just the things that is just spaghetti at the wall.
And I think it's kind of more important than ever because I've spent over the last year, I spent some time just to kind of educate myself and maybe to write about it with a particular AI company that helps other companies implement AI. So as they say, we help companies hire their first AI employee. And so as I've seen them interact with other companies, one of the things that's become apparent to me is that companies, big and small, and people are rushing to implement AI because they feel like they need it and it's alluring. And the implementation often sprawls because they haven't really stopped and identified what is the job to be done or what is the problem to solve and what tool actually fits that problem. So they end up with this sprawling implementation, which leads to what researchers in this area are now calling work slop, like a huge, because the cost of starting something has gone basically to zero almost, that you produce this huge volume of sort of mediocre stuff. And it's just, whether you're an individual or an organization, I think it's never been easier to do too much. And that means that it's all that much more important for us to really clarify priorities and structure the amount of stuff that's coming in the top of the funnel.
Yeah. So it sounds like really kind of knowing what you're trying to get out of AI, knowing what you're trying to get out of that can be really helpful. I'm wondering for you, where have you made changes in your life as a result of this writing?
A number of things. One of which, so the last chapter is a little more personal and philosophical, and about how, so a few years ago after my last book, it kind of took off and allowed me to go on my own, become independent. And I thought that just total freedom over everything I did was what I had always wanted. It's kind of when I in my past life, I was trained to be a scientist, and I switched off that track and became a writer. And from that time, I thought the goal was total independence. So I even went to a writer's retreat and was asked, we all had to answer the question, what are you optimizing for this year? And I said, autonomy. Fast forward a few years, and I have learned that there is such a thing as too much autonomy. Like, I had individualized my schedule so much. It was so convenient for me. But it meant, one, I was making a million decisions about what to do all the time. So it was like just getting bogged down by making a million small decisions. And I had desynchronized my own schedule with everyone to an extent where I was feeling isolated. So some of the research I was reading for the book, like the Harvard Study of Adult Development, which tracked people from cradle to grave, and found that social integration and found that basically that a dense network of reciprocal obligations is crucial to human well-being. And I was not having that. I mean, I had I was parenting, but otherwise I'd kind of retreated into this individualized life. It kind of reminded me of when Mark Zuckerberg first announced the metaverse, and he was like, it's going to be great. We're all going to live in this individualized universe tailored just for you. And it's like, actually, that sounds horrible.
Yeah.
But that's what I kind of did to myself. And so to reel that back, I wanted to ground myself more in obligations where I would see people, where I had an obligation to see people at certain times and places. So I joined a nonprofit board in my community. I joined our dinner club that meets regularly. I started going to these regular dance meetups so I could have some embodied experience with strangers. So these things that are frankly inconvenient for my schedule and that I don't necessarily have to do, but that give me these recurring interactions with people that just made me feel a lot better. So I think some of it was reeling back. You know, this is a very privileged thing to say. It's like, oh, I had too much freedom over my work, and I understand that. But it was so alluring that it actually led me to craft a life that didn't make me feel very good.
Yeah. It's interesting how these things that are often our big goals, where we think, man, 5 years ago, David, or 5 years ago, Joe would be blown away that this is your life. And then still inside, it's like, I need to do more. I need to change. I need to do these things. That sitting with the success and then kind of finding that happiness, like, doesn't just always come easily.
Yeah, no, I don't know another way to put it other than I was just wrong about what I thought would make me feel satisfied, you know, and it makes me, like, late in the book, I write about this research in Sweden where, well, so before Sweden, like in the Soviet Union in the late 20s to keep factories going continuously. They split people into different work weeks. So instead of there being a normal work week, there were kind of 5 different groups, and people would have 4 days of working and then a day off. And so you might have Tuesday off and your spouse might have Wednesday off and so on. And it was a social disaster because it desynchronized everyone's calendars. And this, they had to do away with it. And conversely, in Sweden, there's much more recent research showing that when a large portion of the country is on vacation at once, the amount of antidepressants that are being dispensed goes way down. And it's true, even, you might say, well, of course, people are on vacation, fun. But it's even among retirees who don't need the time off. And so the conclusion of this research was that it's they call it the social control of time, that having time off at the same time as other people, which allows you to synchronize, is really important for people's well-being. And so given the amount of virtual work, hybrid work, the amount of individualization, the power we have over our schedules, and the drive to want to do that, right, to want to have total freedom, I think it can be alluring, but can actually be not so great for us in the long term.
Yeah, it's, in a lot of ways, we've lost so much from smaller communities when, they all had the same schedule of, kind of folk magic or folk festivals where it's like, the spring harvest or the, preparing for winter. And
totally.
So, and to not, we sometimes think that we've come so far with our changes in religious beliefs or changes in scientific beliefs, but then it's also like, well, what is the commonality that in calendar we have with other people other than like 4th of July and Memorial Day and Labor Day?
Absolutely. I mean, I don't know if you've read Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone. It came out, I think, in 2000, but it's amazing to read it now because it feels so prescient, where he's saying the title refers to the fact that things like long suburban commutes and television, so entertainment, television, it seems quaint now compared to what we have, but that at the time it was a move to individual entertainment instead of things like bowling leagues or card clubs or other civic organizations. And so he was documenting this. You were starting to see the decline of bowling leagues and all sorts of civic participation as people were moving into their own sort of entertainment sphere, and that's massively accelerated, right? And his argument was that this is bad for society and civic engagement, but also for individuals. I think, as he famously said, joining a single club cuts your risk of dying in the next year by half. And that's a rule. That's kind of a rule of thumb, but research that's followed up on what he said with a meta-analysis that looked at, I think, 300,000 different people found that that's basically true, and that social integration has a bigger effect, on longevity or your risk of dying than quitting smoking does among cardiac patients. But it's so easy to retreat from all this stuff, right? Like, to go to these dance meetups or this board that I'm on, I have to go somewhere at a certain time, whereas I could just be beaming entertainment that I've chosen that's algorithmically tailored to me without going anywhere. And so I think it requires us, sometimes the things that are the best for us are not the easiest.
Oh, I love that. Sometimes the things that are best for us are not the easiest. David, before we end, I want to hear a little bit about, selfishly, what's it take to become a New York Times best-selling author, other than getting people to buy books? So, like, how does one do that? If I want my next book to have a stronger statistical chance, can't guarantee it, what should I be doing?
Yeah, it's a great question. Because the landscape has changed so much, right? So, and first of all, I think luck is very, very helpful. And I think it's different now than it used to be. When my first book came out, it was get reviewed in the New York Times, write an article for the New York Times, have an excerpt in the Atlantic, those sorts of things. TV now media is so much more fragmented, and so I think it is like doing a lot of podcasts, looking at newsletters, doing adaptation articles. But the good thing about those is no single thing reaches as big an audience as some of the legacy media used to. But you can listen to a podcast or read a newsletter and see this really has the kind of thinking, I think my kind of thinking would appeal to this same audience. And then you can make really tailored pitches in that way. And if you're willing to do that, I think there's a huge amount of opportunity to directly connect with the kind of people that clearly are think in a way that would lend themselves to appreciating the book. And then to be ready to do a lot of that, which is a privilege, right? I mean, for me, I am researching things because I'm really curious about them. And then it's a privilege to be able to talk about the things that I think are interesting. So yeah, I mean, doing a lot of that. And I think putting, differentiating yourself with the book, because no matter what media you do, word of mouth is really important when it comes to books. Like, there's so many easier forms of entertainment. And so I think really thinking of that writing as a craft, and a lot of books I think could have been long magazine articles, and they're kind of hitting on the same point over and over because it's like a book. You have to make it a certain length. If you don't have that material, write a shorter book. Otherwise, I think really take the reader's attention seriously and make it a journey where you're not just hammering the same point over and over in every chapter, but take them somewhere new with each chapter. And I think that lends itself to feeling different than most books and hopefully helpful word of mouth.
Oh, so awesome. David, the last question I always ask is, if every private practitioner in the world were listening right now, what would you want them to know?
I would want them to know that I think it has never been both more difficult and more important for people to have some regular human connection where they feel heard. I think you can go on the internet and very quickly get a sense of how desperate people are to feel seen and listened to. And so I think practitioners can do something that is just incredibly important in this day and age. And I hope we'll be motivated by that. It means that there's some real social challenges and psychological challenges that we have as a society right now, but it also means that you can do something that's just so important, not just that changes individual lives, but that helps us restore some of the important things about society.
So awesome. If people want to get your book, if they want to follow your work, where should we send them?
Books available at all the normal sellers, and davidepstein.com is my website. And there's a link to a free newsletter that I have where I write about some of these things quite regularly.
So awesome. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
It's shows like this that just are so exciting for me as a podcaster, to talk to people that have followed their curiosity, have dug into a topic, have thought through something. Just so grateful for people like David coming on the show. The world of podcasting continues to grow. And more than ever, I'm seeing that licensed mental health practitioners need to be out there doing good work. They need to be out there talking about the mental health issues that they care about, bringing forth that education. There's so many armchair experts that we need to be doing more. And so if you want help with your podcasting journey, we've got some resources over at podcastlaunchschool.com. Would love to talk with you more about doing more podcasting, being connected out in the world, and being able to interview people around your own curiosity. Also, we couldn't do this show without our sponsors. Special thanks to Valent today for sponsoring this show. They put together an amazing resource. It's going to take you 5 minutes to quickly evaluate what's stopping your growth. It's going to pinpoint your biggest bottlenecks right now and give you a 90-day playbook to fix it. You can download that totally free over at valent.io/Joe. That's VALANT.io/Joe to grab that resource. Thank you for letting me into your ears and into your brain. Have a great day. I'll talk to you soon.
Special thanks to the band Silence is Sexy for that intro music, and this podcast is designed to provide accurate and authoritative information in regard to the subject matter covered. It is given with the understanding that neither the host, the producers, the publishers, or guests are rendering legal, accounting, clinical, or other professional information. If you want a professional, you should find one.